If you're looking for a light compact camera for travel, making vlogs, or even YouTube videos, then a point and shoot camera is your best bet. In this video, I'm comparing the top two options, the Canon PowerShot V1 and the Sony ZV1 Mark II, to see which one is right for you.
You gotta just press record.
Hey, welcome back to Think Media. Nate here. Now, before we dive into the comparison between both of these cameras, I do want to mention that no one is sponsoring this video. Canon did lend us the PowerShot V1 for me to make videos on, but other than that, there's no money exchanging of hands. I rented out the ZV1 Mark II to make this comparison because I know a lot of people are interested in either of these cameras. So with that out of the way, let's dive into the comparison, talking about the design and build quality between these two. Now, these are both point and shoot cameras, meaning they have fixed lenses. You can't swap them out. But with that, you have the advantage of having a super compact camera and just having a great lens paired with it. You don't have to worry about swapping out different lenses if you don't want to be overwhelmed by that. Now, if we take a look at the build quality, both of them side by side, we can obviously see that the Canon PowerShot V1 is bigger and more chunky compared to the Sony ZV1 Mark II. So if portability is really what you're going after for, then the ZV1 is obviously going to be a little bit more compact and easy to carry with you. Both of these cameras have flip out touchscreens, which is going to be super helpful if you do plan on being in front of the camera and want to film yourself. You can easily adjust different settings, menu settings on either of these cameras really quickly and easily. And I almost forgot to mention that both of these cameras have a built-in ND filter of 3 stops, so you can enable that when you go outdoors to help you get the proper exposure settings. And when it comes to the build quality, I do want to touch on a couple things. Number one, neither of these cameras are weather resistant. And two, on the quarter 20 on the bottom, your little tripod mount, they're a little bit different on either camera. On the Sony ZV1 Mark II, it's quite far away, so it's not impeding with the battery card slot, which is an improvement over the original ZV1. But on the PowerShot V1, it's kind of right there by the battery slot. So you do have your camera on a tripod. It's going to be harder to access your battery as well as your SD card on this camera. But when you pick up both of these cameras for the first time, you'll notice that the build quality on the Canon PowerShot V1 is just much better built. There is a nice rubberized texture grip, which is going to make it easier to hold. It's not going to slip on you, whereas on the ZV1 Mark II, it actually feels like it might slip out of your hand. So yes, this is a little bit more compact. This is bigger, has a little bit better build quality, and also has an included built-in fan, which is nice, especially if you plan on recording a lot in the elements. Having that fan is going to keep that camera nice and cool and will allow you to record for longer periods of time. Now I want to talk about the video quality between both of these cameras. The Canon PowerShot V1 is capable of recording 4K video up to 60 frames per second, although there is a 1.4x crop. And on the Sony ZV1 Mark II, it is capable of shooting 4K up to 30 frames per second. And if you want to shoot any higher frame rates, you have to drop down to 1080p, which you can go all the way up to 120 frames per second. Now, specs aside, looking at the actual video quality between both of these cameras side by side, the first thing I noticed between these two is the saturation. The Canon seemed to be lower saturation, but may have given a more natural looking image, whereas the ZV1 Mark II is more saturated, but maybe not having as realistic colors. I do want to mention that I was shooting on the natural picture profile on the Canon and the standard on the ZV1 Mark II with the sharpness turned down. So I do recommend experimenting with these different color profiles because you might find something that works for you, and you could always up the saturation on the Canon if you are looking for a more saturated image. But when it comes to the sharpness between both of these cameras, I do find the ZV1 Mark II is slightly softer compared to the PowerShot V1, which seemed to be a bit more detailed. And again, these are pretty minimal differences. But if you're looking to get the most out of these point and shoot cameras, you want to be shooting in a log picture profile. So comparing these two log profiles, on the ZV1 Mark II, I shot in S-Log3, and on the Canon, I shot in Canon C-Log3. But the biggest differences between these two images is that the ZV1 is definitely falling apart a lot more. It is more noisy, and you notice this blockiness in the colors, which definitely doesn't look great. And part of this issue is because the ZV1 Mark II does not shoot 10-bit. You're at 8-bit only on this S-Log profile, and 8-bit video just simply does not have enough color information to be shooting log profiles and color graded appropriately, unless you're very specific with how you expose your image. And in some of these tests where I was off on exposure, which was very intentional, you do notice that there is a lot more grain and color blockiness on the Sony, whereas on the Canon PowerShot V1, this does have the ability to shoot 10-bit. In fact, when you do switch to Canon Log 3, it is always shooting 10-bit video. And this was able to easily grade, and I was able to get an image I wanted without having so much noise and that color blockiness that you would find on the Sony. So hands down, the Canon is much better when it comes to shooting log video. One quirk about shooting 10-bit and Canon log is you do not have the ability to shoot 10-bit in a standard color picture profile. So anytime I'm shooting in the natural profile, I'm actually shooting 8-bit video, which is totally fine for most people. But if you do plan to even color grade that natural looking image a little bit further, you're just not going to have as much color information. I do wish this is something that Canon might change with a firmware update, allow us to shoot in 10-bit even on those standard profiles. And that'll give me a little bit more flexibility depending on how I shoot. Now I do want to touch on the lens on either camera because there are subtle differences that are important to note. Now on the Canon PowerShot V1, we have a 16 to 50 millimeter, and this is a full frame equivalent. So 16 millimeter on a full frame is very wide, and this is one thing I do really like about the PowerShot V1 is how wide of an angle you can get. You can really fit your environment within the frame, and you don't have to stretch out your arm too far to get that framing. And this zooms into 50 millimeter, which is going to allow you to get more close up on fine details. Now take a look at the lens on the Sony ZV1 Mark II. This starts at 18 millimeter and goes to 50 millimeter as well. Basically a similar focal length range. However, that extra 2 millimeter on the wide end does make a huge difference when it comes to the wide angle shot, especially if you are vlogging. You can fit a lot more in the frame with the Canon. But let's talk about the aperture range on both of these lenses. Starting on the wide end, on the Canon, you start at a 2.8 and it goes down to a 4.5. So yes, you do lose light as you zoom in, but this is pretty typical for a point and shoot camera. The Sony ZV1 Mark II starts at an f1.8, and as you zoom in, it goes down to an f4. And this is a pretty big change when it comes to the exposure difference between the zoom range, and it's more noticeable as you zoom in the lens just how darker it gets. Now some of you might be wary that the Canon only starts at f2.8. Is that going to allow in a lot of light? Well, something I forgot to mention on both of these cameras is there is a difference in sensor sizes. The Sony ZV1 Mark II has a 1-inch sensor, which is pretty typical for a point and shoot camera. The Canon PowerShot V1, however, has a 1.4-inch sensor. This is closer to micro four thirds, so this is larger in size. So the difference between f1.8 and f2.8 between the different sensor sizes really isn't that much. Now there are some subtle differences which we'll touch on, and first thing I want to talk about is the shallow depth of field you can expect on the wide angle. And comparing these images both side by side, you will notice that the f1.8 on the Sony does give you a little bit more shallow depth of field compared to the PowerShot V1. Because it is at f2.8 and you're at a wider angle, you're not going to get as blurry of a background, although the differences are quite minimal. However, there is something I do want to bring to your attention is it's not just about the amount of background blur, it's actually the quality of that autofocus background. When you look at the two side by side, you might notice that the Sony's background blur is more smeary in texture, whereas on the Canon, it felt more like a higher quality mirrorless lens where things were distinct in the background and felt much more pleasing to my eye. So even though in some cases you might get more shallow depth of field, a more blurry background on the Sony, I do prefer the lens quality on the Canon PowerShot V1. Moving on to the autofocus test between both of these cameras. Side by side, you can see in real time how the autofocus keeps track as I move closer to the camera as well as further away. And for me, I think that the autofocus is quite comparable. If you are vlogging or going to be in front of the camera, you can be pretty certain that it's going to keep you in focus. But there was a pretty big difference in the autofocus performance when I switched over to a log picture profile. Between these two cameras, the Canon handled the log profile just fine. If I wanted to touch on an object to focus, it would. The ZV1 Mark II actually several times would give me a hard time trying to focus on an object when I'm shooting in that flatter picture profile. It's actually quite frustrating in this shot. When I want to focus on the railing, it would just be hunting the whole time. Eventually I had to switch to manual focus, which was a whole nother issue. It was much too complicated, and I ended up scrapping the shot and move on because it was just too much. So that's definitely nice on the Canon that you can be always confident that the autofocus is going to work. Again, this is only an issue in that log profile, so that may not be a concern for most people. And here is an autofocus test in low light conditions. You can see between both of these cameras how well it keeps me in focus. Now I want to talk about the audio quality between both of these cameras. Both have built-in microphones, which is going to be handy if you are wanting to film yourself and not necessarily want to pack an external microphone. In fact, let's just take a listen between both of these built-in microphones. Here is an audio test between the Canon PowerShot V1 and the Sony ZV1 Mark II. We have them both side by side, so you can tell which one sounds better or if they sound roughly the same. Let me know in the comments down below which one you prefer. Now, as always, plugging in an external microphone is going to always sound better. And fortunately, both of these cameras have a microphone input, so you can plug an external microphone and fit it onto the hot shoe to get better audio quality. However, the Canon takes it a bit further and has a pretty professional feature, I would admit, and that is a headphone jack. So you can actually monitor what your audio quality is going to sound like, which is definitely handy. Another important feature when it comes to handheld shooting is stabilization. Taking a look at the Sony ZV1 Mark II, this camera does not have image stabilization. Not even the lens has stabilization. It does offer digital stabilization, which is going to help smooth things out, but it is going to crop into your frame. On the other hand, the PowerShot V1 does offer lens stabilization, and this is one thing I was super impressed by when I was shooting with this camera out in Hawaii. The lens stabilization is quite good at reducing the number of shakes and jitters, especially when it comes to vlogging or filming yourself. The image is quite stable and is not as distracting compared to the ZV1, which is much more shaky and is definitely harder to watch. So here's a side-by-side test between the Canon PowerShot V1 and the Sony ZV1 Mark II. So you get a sense of the field of view difference as well as the stabilization between these two cameras. When we look at the stabilization test side by side, first without any sort of digital stabilization, you can definitely see where that lens stabilization on the Canon is definitely kicking in and is giving you a much smoother result. It also helps that you have a wider angle at 16mm, so things don't appear to be as shaky. Now switching over to digital stabilization, you only have one mode on the Sony called active stabilization, and this crops into your image quite a bit. Whereas on the Canon, there are a couple different modes of stabilization, which is nice depending on how much you want to crop in and how smooth of an image you want. For this test, I set the Canon to enhanced, and looking at these both side by side, the images look quite stable. You just want to make sure that you are shooting with a lot of lights and maybe cranking your shutter speed up to get a little bit sharper of an image. But both of these images look quite stable if you are planning to use this feature. But honestly, if I was using the Canon as my main vlogging camera, I would just stick to the lens image stabilization because it actually worked quite well and I didn't really feel the need to have that digital stabilization. Now let's take these cameras into a low light situation to see how each camera performs. Having both of these cameras side by side is a great way just to see the difference between the low light image quality, how well it handles sharpness and noise reduction. One thing I do notice on the Canon is because you have a slower lens, f2.8, you do have to crank your ISO a little bit more versus the Sony. If you stay at that f1.8, you don't actually have to raise your ISO as much. So in some of these tests, I was actually able to reduce the ISO on the Sony, which helped give it a cleaner look. Now, even though the Canon has a larger sensor, which is going to help in low light situations, the ZV1 has a faster lens on the wide end, which is going to be helpful in those conditions as well. So to me, the overall low light performance between both of these cameras kind of equal out, and you might have a preference over one over the other, just depending on which look you prefer. Moving on to the battery life between both of these cameras. So I decided to run a test between both of these cameras, shooting 4K 24 frames per second, set a timer, and let them run and record until the battery was exhausted. And the Sony ZV1 Mark II lasted around an hour and 10 minutes before it died. And on the Canon PowerShot V1, it lasted around an hour and 18 minutes before it died. So really, you can't expect to have all day battery life on either of these cameras. And if you plan to do so, then definitely be sure to purchase a few extra batteries so that way it can last you all day. And while we're on the subject, I'll briefly talk about overheating. And during the same test, I didn't have overheating on either of these cameras. The Canon does have a built-in fan, which is going to definitely help it keep it cool. Again, there was no serious overheating issue on either of these cameras. Both do get a bit warm to the touch if you are recording all day, especially out in the sun. So do definitely keep that in mind. But it's definitely nice to have a camera that is going to allow you to record as long as you have enough battery life. So talking about the price points between both of these cameras, the Sony ZV1 Mark II is a couple years old now and costs $898. And on the Canon PowerShot V1, this was much newer, most recently announced, and it cost $899. So it's pretty much the same price between both of these cameras. However, I do think one is more capable when it comes to shooting video, travel, YouTube videos, and the camera I would definitely recommend if you are looking between these two cameras is the Canon PowerShot V1. You have much better 10-bit video quality. You have that awesome image stabilization, which is so great in this little camera. Yes, it is a little bit more chunky, but I actually don't mind having a little bit better build quality and having a more of a better grip on the camera. But if you are looking for something more compact, then obviously the ZV1 Mark II is a little bit easier to take with you. But let me know which camera you decide to pick up in the comments down below. And if you want to learn more about the Canon PowerShot V1, I plan on making a lot more content on this camera, so check out some of those videos right here.